Welcome to Connections with BCD Travel, an ongoing conversation about the modern-day travel program, the impact of technology, and how travel buyers can take control and drive change. What are we waiting for? Let's start connecting.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Connections with BCD Travel. I'm your host, Miriam.
And I'm your co-host, Chad Lemon. We love hearing from you. Connect with us by going to bcdtravel.com/podcast or send an anonymous text through platforms like Apple Podcast or Spotify.
You know, Chad, every year it seems like there is a new buzzword going around in business travel. And most of the time, those buzzwords are real, important topics like sustainability, AI, and wellness. But if you had to pinpoint 2025's buzzword, what would you say it is?
I think the obvious answer would be artificial intelligence, AI. But if I were to pick another one, it's our topic today, ROI, return on investment.
Exactly. And we'll be publishing a podcast on AI very soon. But today we're going to dig into ROI, what it truly means for the travel program, and how travel buyers and managers can help drive ROI into their programs.
And I love both of those topics and our guest today, too. He's a senior director with BCD's consulting arm, Advito, Matt Patterson.
And I'm looking forward to hearing what his insights are for us. So let's jump right in.
Matt, we talked about this at the top of the show, but why is ROI seemingly one of these, buzzwords of 2025 in business travel?
I think even just what's been happening recently in the economy with tariffs, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And so I think some of the corporate buyers are getting a little skitterish on where they're going to invest their money. And so, just like with anything else, if there's limited funding available, the return for that investment is critical. So it's critical to get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, and to tailor your program to meet your needs and to drive enhanced value.
And while I'm sure we all know what ROI means, what do you think it means from your perspective when it comes to business travel and for business travel programs?
Well, historically, it was all about savings. What do you, what's being delivered now versus the last contract? Mm-hmm. But now it's evolving into more, squeezing value out of multiple different areas within supplier relationships. And really investing smarter to achieve maybe even eventual savings. Like for an example, travel risk management. We're finding that investing in a thorough risk assessment and a tangible strategy plan actually has driven lower insurance premiums for some clients who have invested in this area.
Matt, we're big fans here on the Connections podcast of making lists. So I'm going to ask you, can you give me a list of your top tips on how to drive better ROI? And then we can explore each one of them in more detail.
Sure. So I think maybe a list of 4. One would be leveraging cost avoidance. The second would be managing your program dynamically. The third would be negotiating smarter. And then fourth actually is in engagement and using digital marketing to engage your travelers.
Okay, so let's dig into that first point, leveraging cost avoidance. What's that?
So historically, as I said, obviously when you negotiate a contract, you're going to want to make it hopefully more lucrative than the previous one. But now, from an avoidance perspective, we're trying to get our clients back to zero. Just the climate is a little bit different now post-COVID. And so, cost avoidance is actually becoming very, very important, getting the program even just back to level. And then things like, for example, in the hotel program, what can you negotiate? What are the other elements within a hotel program other than rates that can be negotiated that actually drive value? And, this is all really in a climate where we are seeing travel volumes dropping for many of our clients right now, just because of the uncertainty we talked about.
And I think your second point is really good, managing your program dynamically. I assume you mean that you don't just set it and forget it every year when it comes to your contract negotiations, right?
That's exactly correct. We have found that there's typically a lot of low-hanging fruit to be picked, so to speak, throughout the life cycle of a supplier contract, especially in the hotel space. So that's what we mean by managing it dynamically. Don't just source it and then ignore it until the next sourcing cycle.
What would a travel manager find themselves potentially doing outside of the normal procurement cycle when you say manage dynamically?
Well, you hit on one piece for sure, understanding where demand is going. So making sure that you've got coverage in potentially new markets or being able to actually even get rid of suppliers in markets that aren't necessary anymore. So that's a couple of examples.
Okay. And then you mentioned negotiate smart. What's that?
What's becoming critical right now is basically delivering on what you negotiate, so what you agree to in the actual RFP. Suppliers are increasingly monitoring share targets or volume commitments, things like that. And we are seeing that they are taking punitive measures when those share targets or volume commitments are not adhered to or met.
Really? Okay. And you snuck in a bonus point about engaging travelers. Tell us about that.
Well, what we've found is that letting your travelers know the guts of the program, understanding what you've negotiated, understanding what's expected of them as a traveler, that has become a really critical component in the travel management space. So, you could have the best procurement policies and practices in the world, but if you can't communicate that to your traveler base, all of that procurement work really has limited efficacy. So you might not be able to directly drive cost savings as part of the RFP, but you can actually use digital marketing to influence behavior. And that behavior in and of itself could actually lead to incredible cost savings. So for example, if you are able to drive your average booked rate down year over year in the hotel space, that should be procurement accepted savings.
But we like to focus on how technology makes business travel better here on the podcast. So Matt, what role do you say technology plays in driving ROI?
Well, I would argue that it's not only just huge, but it's basically, technology is probably the biggest contributing factor to driving real ROI. So it's got to be used in such a way that it's correct for your particular program. So, and what I mean by that is, specifically on what what the client's travel footprint is, layered over what the supplier footprint is, so that there's good alignment. Other examples could be, configuration and messaging in the online booking tool. So that's going to help deliver volumes, which is going to help you get better rates. Airfare predictor type tools so that you can budget correctly and forecast for your C-suite. There's price assurance technologies out there that ensure that you're always getting the best rates, regardless of when your travelers actually book their ticket or book their hotel. And then even things in the data consolidation space, that technology drives huge insights, especially when we're talking about leakage and things of that nature, so to understand where spend is essentially rogue and how to bring that back in-house.
The very first episode of this season, we had Alyssa Morlino on the podcast, and she talked at length about not being bedazzled by the latest and greatest technologies that you see out there, but really digging into what's available for your program and who you are as a company. So what's your advice here on the podcast today?
Well, I'm very much of the mantra, it's one thing to have fancy data visualization tools, but if the bells and whistles aren't pointing towards value creation opportunities, then, in my opinion, what's the point?
Right.
So really, if your travel management company isn't, part of this equation, and if they're not a trusted partner where you can have open and candid conversations with them about what you're seeing in the market, what you're seeing in the data, and exploring, program opportunities, really, I think you're with the wrong TMC.
Matt, I want to dig in on one last thing that you had mentioned, and that's on negotiations. We all know how important they are to corporate negotiated rates, but the research team at Advito have even unlocked some interesting findings about those corporate negotiated rates and best rates available, non-cancellation rates with hotels, etc. What can you tell us about how negotiations drive ROI, maybe even specifically around hotels?
What we're finding is that we're spending a lot more time negotiating non-pricing related items, such as LRA versus NLRA. And so the acronym for that is last room availability versus non-last room availability. Breakfast and parking inclusion into the hotel rate as another example. Status level matching, whether it's hotel or air. And then mostly in the airspace, but something we would call, waivers and favors funds, so things that if it's, cancellation fees or change fees or things of that nature, which would typically cost money, but you can negotiate that into the contract. Yeah. So it's not a specific pricing element per se, but it's definitely something that's going to drive ROI when it's used. And then to your point, Chad, absolutely, cancellation policy negotiation, that's become a huge part on the hotel space. The hoteliers are pushing right now to drive towards 48-hour advance. And when the traveler doesn't understand that and then they cancel, but they don't have that 48-hour advance, it drives huge losses.
Okay, Matt, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember from this episode about ROI and how they can ensure that they're getting the most value for their programs?
Well, I think within ROI, we need to be creative. The program needs to be looked at from multiple viewpoints, really, not just as the travel managers and not from a profit and loss perspective. So, for example, what are the value drivers for the road warriors of the company? What are the value drivers for the executives or the admins who book for the executives? And then really how successful is the contract as it's defined by your suppliers? That needs to be a critical piece as well. But really investing in the right areas of the program, that's what's going to drive the best savings. And ROI shows up really in multiple areas of the business. So whether it's wellness, employee retention, duty of care,
right,
and insurance, like we spoke of before. So there's lots of different levers that can get pulled.
Okay, Miriam, what do you think the buzzword of 2026 will be?
Well, for me, it's going to be 7 to 10 business days.
Solid answer, and I hope that you're right.
That's all for this episode, folks. Be on the lookout for our next buzzworthy episode about AI coming soon.